Hello, botanists, tree lovers, tree students, tree speakers, confronters of history, and revealers of history. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm with Brooke Warner. And Brooke, as I read our guest Beronda Montgomery's amazing book of botany, personal history, and national history, When Trees Testify, I thought about how rare it is that a book can, really profoundly change the way I look at the world. And Beronda introduced me to a new way to think about trees, for example. She sees them as testifiers and witnesses to all they've seen, and that they carry the trauma and the joy of what they've seen, especially as it relates to the enslavement at the center of Black American history. And for example, the trees used as hanging trees, witnessed lynchings, and she says they changed physically as a result. So each tree holds its own story, and it's not just a botanical story. So I just found that just so fascinating. And so it's such a new way to think about trees and plant life in general. So, Brooke, I just want to start by asking you a simple question. Have you ever talked to a tree?
It's a great question. And I want to say, what California native hasn't? I don't think I've actually talked out loud to a tree in a long time. But when you're up in the redwoods, for instance, I do feel like it's impossible not to telegraph to them a little bit. Like, they're just so astounding and enormous. And you think about, how long they've been on the earth. And so I certainly have felt that. I do have one foundational tree story to share, though, which is that I grew up across the street from a park, and we had a climbing tree. It was the perfect size for a kid. Like, it wasn't huge, but it also wasn't super easy to get into. So you did have to climb, and it had at least 4 good limbs for sitting. And so I did make it kind of my after school and weekend house. And each of the limbs was a different room. And I had a reading room, if you can imagine. And that was the first branch. It was the most comfortable. It had a little thing that you kind of like held your back, And so I would go up there with my book and just spend hours. And it's astounding to me because now I think about how much discomfort I would have, like climbing a tree or sitting in a tree for even 5 minutes at this age. But that tree really did hold me. And I was young, I'm talking like 10 and younger. But it was a place of refuge and peace. And I really did see it as mine. And, that's, I think, the power of trees. You can see them as homes and beings in their own right, for sure. And so, yeah, I'm curious about your experience, Grant.
Yeah, first, I just love that story. And I think you should write it as a children's book somehow. And I just love how you made it your house. I just keep thinking of this young Brooke going from limb to limb with her books and finding the reading sanctuary on a limb. And it sounds almost as if you were in training to become Julia Butterfly Hill, who,
right.
If you don't know, listeners, she protested redwood logging by living in the top branches of a redwood. It's a really amazing story. I saw a documentary on it. But to answer your question, I don't think I've talked to a tree, but like you, I have had close relationships with trees, and there was one kind of huge granddaddy tree in my backyard as a kid that we played around, and it had a tire swing on it, and it just had this sort of powerful biblical presence. That's the way I think of it, as if it had been there since the beginning of time. And I definitely thought of it as a protector. And when I go back to my hometown now, even though my parents don't live there for a long time, we haven't lived there, but I drive by to kind of check on it. And then, like you, I built a tree fort and another tree in the backyard, an apple tree, but I didn't luxuriate and live in it like you did. I remember a nearby weeping willow where we'd hide out, and then my neighbor was an amazing arborist, and she'd get mad. Actually, she's very protective of her trees, so when we climbed in her trees, she'd kind of chase us off. And on that note, it's amazing to me that as a kid, at a moment's notice, I'd just jump up and climb a tree just for the heck of it, just because it was there. I just can't even imagine doing that these days. Now I like to sit by trees and lean on trees. So I'm very much in a different relationship, but it's still interesting that we both found protection and refuge and adventure in trees. And the reason I ask that question is because Beronda opens with a memory of being a teenager at Arkansas Governor's School and being asked by a language arts teacher to go outside and talk to a tree. And her first reaction was basically, "Are you serious?" Because who talks to trees? But then 30 years later, she's standing under a 600-year-old oak at McLeod Plantation in South Carolina. And she says the tree is speaking to her, not in a mystical sense, or not only in a mystical sense, but in a biological, historical, material sense. And trees carry evidence, she puts forth. Trees testify, as I mentioned.
Right. And that word testify is really important to the book. I mean, it's in the title, but it's a through thread. And Beronda is a plant biochemist. She knows the science. She uses that science to make an argument about witnessing. And she says that trees literally carry the transformed breath of the humans who lived among them, which is just an image that I honestly had never thought of before. Obviously, carbon dioxide is exhaled by people. She talks about in the book, by enslaved people working in those fields in front of this seminal important tree that she sort of bases her story around. And it's really fascinating. And so that McLeod oak contains in its actual physical body the breath of those people held captive on that land. And so it's not just a metaphor, it's actually biology. And I just was really taken by that and how Beronda refuses to let science and story be separate things, which I think is really powerful. And so she's a memoirist, but also a biochemist. And those things, coexist, which is kind of what is always fun about memoir, is exploring new ways to enter.
Yeah, this shapes the whole architecture of the book. Each chapter is organized around a specific tree: pecans, sycamores, willows, poplars, mulberries, oaks, cottonwood, apples. And each tree becomes a lens for a chapter of Black American history. It's just such an inventive and interesting way to tell the story. And such an amazing structure. I'm actually working with an arborist who is writing a memoir, and he's organizing his narrative around significant trees in his life. So I immediately told him about this book, The pecan chapter is especially interesting, joyful, fraught, and disturbing all at the same time. Beronda talks about her grandmother's pecan groves in Arkansas and the smell of roasting pecan and ice cream days, and it's all warmth and family memory. And then she introduces Antoine, who was an enslaved man in 1846 Louisiana who figured out how to graft pecan trees, which is evidently just extraordinarily difficult technically. But in doing so, he basically founded the commercial pecan industry in the United States, and then that industry is now worth up to $1 billion a year. But he's been almost erased. His enslaver's ledger calls him a Creole Negro gardener and expert grafter, and that's essentially it. His trees were later cut down when the plantation changed hands, and his name, his lineage, his story were just completely erased. And yet, the entire pecan economy of the American South grows from his hands.
Yeah, these are the stories that are in this book that literally unearth all these, things about how people are not recognized for what they have contributed, and also how we as readers see history in the natural world. And I think she makes an incredible argument that this erasure is not accidental, it's a pattern, and that is really important for us to look at when we're considering a memoir like this, which is really in some ways attempting to right a wrong. She also discusses Indigenous women whose botanical knowledge guided famous expeditions, which is super interesting. Enslaved African women whose irrigation expertise built the rice industry. Scientists and farmers and healers whose contributions were absorbed into American wealth without acknowledgement. Very common, of course. And so I just found, that she's doing something that has this driving purpose to reclaim story. Obviously, we've talked about this grant in so many other contexts. But this is about reclaiming her ancestors, the ancestors of many people, who were just sort of relegated to a place in history and not giving credit for their contributions. And then she's writing herself as a Black woman plant scientist who spent 20 years as the only Black person in her department. And it's also this lineage that she's tracking. And I do think this thing about acknowledgement and credit is really important. She is doing something I felt when reading her, she's asserting, she's saying, this is something that I want you to pay attention to, whose names rise up through history and who gets credit for things and who doesn't.
She tells one story that really made me think deeply about these issues. And these were these trees near her family home that the adults would steer children away from. And it was similar to the big tree in my backyard where we played as kids. But these were big old oaks at the edge of the woods, but nobody would explain why the kids shouldn't play near the trees. But she says as she grew older, she began to wonder if they were hanging trees, trees where Black people were lynched. And so when I read this story, it made me think about how, we need DEI education, obviously, and training now more than ever. And that's because, stories like this and this book really offer a metaphor for the different ways white and Black people see and experience the world. The tree I see as a beautiful tree with a tree swing for kids, but that same tree might be haunted with violence for an African American. And a book like this, really attunes the reader to a history that isn't on the surface, but one we can discover if we listen in a different way and open ourselves up to layers and nuances and secrets and untold stories. But honestly, most white Americans, myself included, just don't know those stories or don't see the world through them. So we unwittingly perpetuate this trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the book in miniature. What you just said, what do we inherit that we aren't told? What do trees remember that the people around can no longer say or just have never been able to say out loud? I think it's really interesting. Of course, it's this idea, right? Like trees as witnesses. It's a really great premise, actually. And the memoir operates at so many levels: personal, familial, national, and biological. And Beronda is writing this memoir of her relationships with plants. And she's also writing a family memoir of botanical knowledge passed down through generations, also a cultural memoir of Black American history, and then like natural history to boot. So I just love the way that she did this. And it's a deeply thinking book. It's like it's got so many layers, and it opened me up to thinking about things that I truly had never thought about before, which is a wonderful gift.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, this is a book that trusts its readers to hold complexity. And it's a book that, we think memoirs will find enormously generative, not just as a subject, but as a model for what memoir can do. So we're thrilled to have Beronda Montgomery here to talk about it. And she will be with us after this short break. Welcome back, everybody. I am super thrilled to introduce Beronda Montgomery, who's a PhD and a writer and a researcher and a scholar who pursues a common theme of understanding how individuals perceive, respond to, and are impacted by the environments in which they exist. And her primary laboratory-based research has been focused on the responses of photosynthetic organisms like plants and how they react to external light cues. Additionally, Beronda pursues this theme in the context of effective mentoring and leadership of individuals and the role of innovative leaders in supporting success. She is the author of 2 books: When Trees Testify, Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy, and that's what we're really going to focus on today. And then Lessons from Plants, which came out in 2021 with the Harvard University Press. Welcome, Beronda.
Thank you so much. It's thrilled to be here.
As I was telling you before we started the show, this book really did affect me deeply, and it really shifted my frame on so many things in life. And you opened the book by describing yourself as a reluctant visitor to the McLeod plantation. You didn't want to go, and you were even tried to talk the rain into canceling the tour. And yet that visit becomes the emotional and intellectual center of the whole book. So I was wondering if you can talk about this scene a little bit more. And I'm curious what it means to write toward the thing you are also resistant to.
I think over the course of my life, I've learned when resistance comes up not to turn away from it. And this was one such moment. I really had a lot of hesitation about going simply because it's a little traumatic to think about the history that lives in those places and being connected to individuals who would have been enslaved or held captive in those places. And it isn't the idea of visiting itself that was problematic, but visiting and wondering if I would find an environment there that would really meet the gravity with which I was showing up in this space. But I'm thankful that I do these things with people who challenge me, my family, my friends, to really not walk away from resistance. Often in my life, I've found that the greatest growth and the greatest gifts I've come when I confront the resistance, because the resistance is telling me something that I need to grapple with. And I think this is one of those cases where really confronting the resistance allowed me to have an encounter with that McLeod oak that really changed the way I think about trees, changed the way that I want to be in relationship with and sharing their stories. And so I've learned to meet resistance with curiosity as opposed to kind of a run away from it type of response.
Can you tell us more about that particular tree and what you felt in that moment? Because it was so many things at once, right? It was somehow mystical, but not mystical. And the way you talked in your book about trees as holding testimony and testifying is just fascinating me.
Yeah, so that particular tree, I have to say that my initial response to it was simply as a plant scientist. It was beautiful. It's massive. Its branches just kind of span out. So I was initially just attracted to the beauty of the tree. And I've always had a fascination with seeing deciduous trees in winter when you can see the full trunk and branches, because you can kind of see the history where there are scars, where there's new branches that look like they were appearing. So I was initially attracted to it in that sense. And then when the cultural guide said that that tree was estimated to be about 400 years old, I immediately had this sense that that tree would have been standing there when enslaved ancestors were there. So then it took on a deeper kind of sense for me that it was a privilege and an honor to be able to stand with a living being that would have been in place when ancestors would have been there. So I went from that kind of fascination with the tree as a plant scientist to this confronting of history. And then when I shared with my sister and son who I was traveling with, that because we exhale carbon dioxide, our breath can be converted to sugars and then compounds that make wood. So their breath was captured. It then became this kind of, I think you used the word mystical. It was mystical. It was a synergy where my interest in plant science, feeling a connection to history, and then also having a way to connect to own personal stories really felt like they collided. And so that one tree became a catalyst, I would say, for my interests coming together in a way that led to me ultimately continuing to pursue interest and leading to a book like When Trees Testify.
It's so fascinating. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's that scientific fact actually that you just mentioned that's really at the heart of the book, that this idea that the trees carry the transformed breath of the humans who lived among them. It's biology, but it's something else too. And I'm curious, was it that moment when you talked to your son and your sister about it that you understood that this would be the spine of the book, or was it other moments? I'm just so curious to know about like that aha, like, oh, this is going to be the construct.
Yeah, it wasn't fully that. I mean, it was that from the perspective that when I left there, I ended up writing an article about that tree. But at the time I saw that tree, I was actually finishing the writing of my first book. So I was focused on finishing Lessons from Plants. That was in 2019. But once I wrote the article and started to get some interactions from that, I then encountered a couple of other old trees, and I realized it was bigger than that one tree. And so then I think it became that there is definitely something here. And one of the stories that I saw about another old tree connected deeply to my family history. So that's when it started to come to me, the full kind of braiding of memoir, history, and science. So it was a slow walk towards it, but it did set, definitely it's rooted and started with that first encounter with the McLeod oak for sure.
Well, another kind of foundational moment in the book, I think, comes when you talk about Antoine, who is one of the most haunting figures in the book. And he's actually a man who founded the pecan industry, and he's remembered only as a Creole Negro gardener. And you're a plant biochemist who's, you've done plenty of grafting yourself, so you know how technically demanding this work is. And I'm interested in that, I think, as an invitation or a frame. Each of the books that leads each of the chapter, it becomes a way to reclaim a story, and we talk a lot about reclaiming stories in different ways with memoirs. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that need to reclaim and what reclaiming their stories did for you.
I think the reclaiming of the story started as a personal journey in that I've been both, I don't even know how to describe it, but throughout my career, as I've been often the first Black woman or Black person at all to enter a space, whether it's a graduate program or a university as a professor, there's been this kind of desire to celebrate that I'm a first generation professor, in this department at Michigan State, or first generation. And that's always felt a little odd to me because I grew up with people who had great knowledge for growing plants and cultivating plants. So I think part of the journey was me first asking, what kind of legacy am I standing upon? And then once I started to realize there was this deep legacy, not only in my family, but also kind of a national legacy of African Americans having contributed to agriculture, I really wanted to explore and ask which individuals could we come to know and celebrate by name. Anton is one of the ones that came forward through my reading, through my interest in pecan trees. And then there's others whose names we can't really call, but I still think there's a way for us to honor their contributions. I talk in the book a little bit about how women from West Africa were brought to the United States because of their deep understanding of the rice industry, and that the rice industry in the U.S. is really built upon their expertise. So I think the exploration it was a personal journey of me understanding my own kind of path and legacy. But then also once I understood it and felt like I could write clearly about it and translate it, it felt like I had an opportunity to help us acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of some others like Anton. I tried to find names where I could, and where I couldn't find names, I tried to find enough of the story for us to still understand the contributions that these individuals might have been able to make.
Well, and your grandmother also is one such person, and you write very movingly about her botanical knowledge, her pecan groves, her herbal concoctions, and she had family healing recipes. This knowledge at that time and in that context wasn't called science. It was called grandmother knowledge. So how do you think about the relationship between indigenous or passed down knowledge and institutional science, and the way that those categories have historically been used to assign or deny credit?
Yeah, that is such an amazing question, because I think it's one that I've encountered a lot, even once I started writing the first book, and in conversations I've had with other writers. An indigenous writer, Jessica Hernandez, is a friend of mine who's had 2 books out, and she talks about indigenous knowledge and eco-knowledge. It's one of those things that is often something I grapple with, because I've come to appreciate and fully acknowledge that grandmother knowledge or indigenous knowledge is complete in and of itself. And a lot of the ways when we think about how our pharmaceutical industry or other industries have really been based on plant knowledge, a lot of those things that are effective, you can go back and see that they were used in indigenous practices here in the Americas or in the global South. And so for me, I have tried to have an appreciation for all forms of knowledge. I mean, I've certainly benefited. I think about a few years back when the COVID vaccine got me out of being in my house for a year and a half. I was really grateful for advanced technical knowledge. But I've also been really grateful that I can go back to mixing up some teas with herbs and leaves that I learned about in family recipes, and that sometimes those are as effective or more effective as something I can pick up at the pharmacy. So I think what I hope is that we can have a greater appreciation for all forms of knowledge, and that we don't have to necessarily prioritize one over the other, but ask when certain knowledge has benefit for us, and to appreciate all forms of knowledge and celebrate them as complete and whole in and of themselves.
Well, one part of the knowledge in the book that you conveyed that's worth celebrating is the history of Black Americans. And I learned so much about that. And this one story in particular, I had no idea about this, but there's this striking moment in the pecan chapter where you describe how Black Americans in the Jim Crow South were not allowed to buy vanilla ice cream except on July 4th. And so butter pecan, black walnut, these became the flavors of celebration and consolation. And the book keeps finding these places where racism has inscribed itself into the most intimate and sensory details of daily life. And I think this is the story that many of us actually don't know, and the reason we should have DEI education and training, for example. So I was wondering if you can just tell us more about the research and the testimony that led you to discover those details.
It's interesting. Since the book has come out, it's been so surprising to me at book events or book festivals how many African American people have come up and said, I just always thought my family liked black walnut. I didn't know why. It just seems that amongst the certain people who have roots in the South, black walnut and butter pecan are common. And so I think, for me, I followed my curiosity. So much has come from reading. I've been an avid reader since I learned to read really early, even before kindergarten. And I remember encountering that fact first, as I said in the book, when I was reading one of the volumes of Maya Angelou's autobiography. So I think over the years, I've been very interested in specific things and kind of look for them. But I also have been one who loved, I was always the child who was hanging out with my grandparents or my great aunts and great uncles. I usually always have a friend who's in their 80s or 90s. And so part of it has also just come from being in community intergenerationally and wanting to sit and hear and learn. I think also in the apple chapter, I talk about this, these Christmas fruit bags that would go along. And I kept asking, why do we get this? Like, I get this every year and I'm tired of this. So I think sometimes those interests in those particular things are just asking curiosity questions, but also trying to be a good listener and connector across generations often has also led me to facts. And then once I have a fact, the researcher in me comes to play, and I want to find out what are the roots of it and what are the stories and histories that are underlying it.
Now, it makes you a great writer. Absolutely. And you describe a forbidden oak tree near your family's home. And it's a tree that the adults would hurry children away from, and they never explain why. And then you say you grew older and began to worry if it was a hanging tree. You never confirm it, but that unconfirmed wondering feels deliberate on the page. And so I'd love to hear you speak to that a little bit, like a choice to let certain things remain in the realm of possibility rather than known.
I think part of it was trying to be authentic to the knowledge. And I think it's a part of life to have some things that are never fully resolved. But the wondering about it itself can be an invitation to know more. So even wondering if it were such a tree allowed me to have some conversations with relatives. And even though we never confirmed that, when talking with them, they had these fears about moving around in certain spaces. I've since gone back to that area and looked back at some historical maps. And I don't know for sure that was a hanging tree, but I know on the other side of that tree was a farm that was owned by a white farmer who was not very friendly to African Americans in the community. So now it may have been that they were trying to keep us away from a particular space. But that tree was the entryway between kind of the space that we could go through. And on the other side was this farmer's land. But I think the intrigue, I like to leave it sometimes because that's what keeps us engaged in life. Sometimes getting the answer isn't the thing that we have to do, but the curiosity will lead us to have conversations, will lead us to connection. And I wanted to be authentic to the moment. We didn't know that it was, but we knew that the feelings and the emotions that it was invoking in our parents and our aunts and uncles was something we recognized as them being very fearful for something that might happen to us. And I think even that is something we have to think about. I have a 23-year-old son. We live at a time where I'm not so much worried about him going out and being lynched, but if I don't hear from him and he's been out for a while and I can't figure out where he is, there is sometimes this fear. And so I also wanted to just for people to identify with that fear that was real to that time, but also might echo for them ways in which there are still fears that show up in our country because of our unresolved issues around race and otherisms.
Yeah, there's that intergenerational trauma that exists, and you write about land trauma and how disenchanted many Black Americans feel toward farming and agricultural land because of its association with forced labor and suffering. And I think it's interesting because this book is an argument for reclaiming that relationship, and yet there is the trauma that exists as well. So I was wondering if you could speak to both, I guess, holding and going into that trauma while also reclaiming the story at the same time without one erasing the other.
For me, it's been an important lesson in many different areas of life, right? That we often have to hold two things as true that seem like they're not compatible. And I do think that when you think about kind of the African-American presence in agricultural lands, there's a new book out called Africulture that talks about this some as well, from a person who has been a multi-generational farmer. And it is a space where I think it's important to hold two things as true. we have to hold to an account the real experience of African Americans in this country, which is something we struggle with. So I don't want to ask people to turn away from the trauma, but I think you can also say that within their trauma, there is a great legacy of expertise and contributions and bravery and stick-to-itiveness that I don't want to give up as well. And I think in the ability to hold those two things as true, I can persist in my life as a Black plant scientist, acknowledging the legacy that I've come from, but also having a great pride that I continue. And I think it's that kind of holding of two things as true that is the answer to a lot of problems that we have to navigate in the world. And I think until we're able to do that, we end up in a place where we are in this country where we really struggle to navigate genderism or sexism or racism, because it's hard to say we've done these horrible things in the past when it comes to such groups. And yet there's also these positive things that we can celebrate. And so for me, I wanted to demonstrate the ability to hold those two things as true, because it's been critically important for me individually, but I also think it's a skill that we have to have collectively to kind of navigate history and move into a hopefully more positive and collective future.
Beautifully said. Thank you. That both and stuff is so important. And, in closing, your book is, among other things, an invitation. And you say explicitly that you want it to invite others to reflect anew on what testimonies trees have to offer. And Grant and I had some fun thinking about our own experiences with trees and, histories and all of that. So what do you hope that readers do after they finish?
I do. It's been really heartwarming already to engage with some readers who say, I just don't even look at trees the same again. When I go on a hike, I stop and breathe intentionally. But also, I think so many of us have stories from our past, a tree that was at a grandparent's house, a tree near a school, that really draws us back to those particular memories. And so I think thinking of nature as a part of our existence is something that I hope people will do. And I also hope that when people think about their impact on the environment, whether it's their breath being captured by a tree, that we might be thinking about that intentionally. Like, is this breath I'm exhaling, is it a breath that I'm exhaling doing something valuable? Is it something I'm doing intentional? And so for me, I hope that it causes us to think more intentionally about our engagement with each other and with nature. But also, if people just see trees and think about them differently and wonder what kind of tree it is and what its experience, I will consider that a win as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Beronda. This is a real treat to get to talk to you, and really love the book, of course.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, both of you, Grant and Brooke.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Hey everyone, today's trend comes from our recent Ask Us Anything that we held for our Memoir Nation community. And I think we'll do a lot more of those, Brooke, because it was just so great and people brought such good questions, and a lot of them very specific in nature, and many of them were pretty straightforward in nature, about things like form and subgenre and word count. So I thought it'd be fun to telegraph out some of these answers to our broader listenership. And today we'll do word count. And this qualifies as a trend, we think, because word counts are definitely getting shorter. And you see that in your own submissions, Brooke, and in the world of publishing. So say a bit more about what this shift has been about.
Yeah, it has been, I guess, a noticeable acceptance of shorter work. When I worked in traditional publishing from 2000 to 2012, and especially when I was acquiring Memoir for Seal Press, we wouldn't have published anything under 60,000 words. I mean, maybe if it was very visual, because of anything very visual can, of course, have fewer words. But most of the memoirs that we did were between 70 and 80,000 words, sometimes upward of 90 to 100,000. And so I think that there's just a lot of things that are changing and have been changing that make shorter work more desirable. And one is that memoir has changed, which you and I, of course, have been tracking. These fragmented forms, vignettes, memoir in verse, hybrid memoir, all of these kinds of memoirs will lend themselves to shorter lengths, not necessarily or always, but definitely it's kind of a trend, which we're covering. And then publishers are seeing that people have attention spans that are dwindling. I think that's sort of a sad reality of our economy right now, of just how much there is to consume. We've talked about that as well. Like, we feel it. Readers are reading less. And so a short book can feel less daunting. Shorter books are less expensive. So if you think about the margins, if you're selling a short book at the same price point, then you're making more money. So that's kind of a lot of reasons, if you think about it, both practical and following what's happening in the culture.
Yeah, such a confluence of different types of reasons all at once. And, we often talk about Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful, because it's just such a beautiful example of the fragmented form. And her book isn't short in page count, but it does have a lot of white space, which I find interesting, especially since I'm writing my own memoir with a lot of white space. And it can be very weird to put like a single sentence on a page and then have the rest of it be white. And Maggie does that frequently and in very interesting ways. So I'm curious what you think of that, Brooke.
I mean, it's nice, right? Like, readers like a little breathing room, and it does have this kind of poeticness to it. Interestingly, right now I'm reading Christina Baker Klein's new novel, The Foursome, and I've noticed that she has wider margins, the ways in which the text is not packed in too tight. I think that publishers are conscious of not making books feel too dense or the type too small. Readers want a more inviting reading experience these days, whether they articulate it or not. And I think that's another thing that is just lending itself almost by default to shorter books.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like right now it's really interesting because people are carrying with them like an older notion of a book or a conventional book. And so some people have a book that might be something like 80,000 to 100,000 words. What would your advice be to them? Should they try to get it down to 60,000 now with their revisions?
I wouldn't go that far. I still think that memoir is in the sweet spot of 70 to 80,000 words. Maybe in 5 years, I'll be saying something different. That said, like, there are more and more books that are shorter, and all writers should just be looking at their work and asking themselves, where can they boil it down to their essence? Early drafts can tend to be very wordy. Some writers are really good at self-editing or cutting. Others are very much not. And then I work with a lot of writers at She Writes Press who will say that they literally cannot imagine cutting anything. They don't know where to cut. And I'm always telling them, a good editor will always be able to cut your words. And it's not gratuitous. It's just good to get someone in there reading your work for pacing and meaning and for what really matters. And if the result of that is being shorter, then in my book, that's definitely a good thing.
Yeah, and I think what's one more thing that's interesting about this recent trend is how it's aligned with price. I remember reading at least a year or two ago that the costs of book, the paper, all of it is going up in price, of course.
Yeah.
So books are getting more expensive, even if the trend is towards shorter books. So any commentary on that?
Yeah. Books are getting more expensive because paper is getting more expensive, and we're literally in an inflationary moment right now, and publishers are reacting to that. We just increased our baseline price from $17.99 to $18.99 for the trade paperbacks that we published. I have been writing for a while that books are underpriced. If you compare them to something like movie tickets, for instance, a reading experience is going to last you so many more hours than a movie, and then you get to keep the actual product after you're finished. But books have always been underpriced relative to other entertainment. And so, you can't be too expensive or you won't sell books. That said, I think if people want a book, they're of course going to buy it within a range of an extra $1 or $2. And so I'm sure you've noticed, Grant, like I just mentioned, I bought The Foursome. It was $30 for a hardcover. It does feel expensive, but I also think that book pricing needs a reset.
Yeah. And maybe we can find some way to give a tub of popcorn and a really large, nice. big gulp Coke with every book. Yeah, but thanks for that perspective. It's really interesting to hear. And I know I get this question, and we'll probably get it forever. How long can a book be? And it gets to be more and more of a complicated answer every time. And I want to thank listeners for hanging in there with us till this point, and to tell you that we're going to keep exploring all the complicated answers of publishing and writing. And thanks for tuning in. And please tell your friends and your family and the clerk at your grocery store, your mechanic, your dentist, tell them all to join memoirnation.com because we've got a lot happening here. So we'll see you next week.